Okay, shalom to everyone. Hope people can hear me. And that's it. So I've been asked to do a session today on the Daf Yomi, and in doing so, we're probably joining tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who will be studying this page today. So I want to jump straight into it, but I was asked before we actually look at our page to say a few words about the Daf Yomi project in general. And I think that it's worthy looking at this as an idea, as an educational program, but also as a political statement. And there's a lot to be learned from the Daf Yomi itself. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And here we are, and we'll go straight into it. So our first slide is Rabbi Meir Shapiro, who lived from 1887 to 1933. And this is the man who instituted the idea of the Daf Yomi. He was Rosh Yeshiva in yeshiva called Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, or the Sages of Lublin. Lublin is a city in Poland, and it had a very big yeshiva there. And when he was the Rosh Yeshiva in that yeshiva, they instituted in that yeshiva that they should study one page of Talmud a day. That in addition to the regular course of studies. In other words, that wasn't the courses you were doing, that wasn't your curriculum, but that was considered something that you would just do on the side so that you would enrich your knowledge of Talmud. I do have to say that nowadays, a page of Talmud is considered a tremendous amount of Talmud. And a lot of people, when you say you do Daf Yomi, they say, how could you do a whole page in a day? A whole page of Talmud is a tremendous amount of Talmud. But when they instituted it, that was considered, it was kind of nothing. It would be kind of, today is a day of charity appeals. So if they say, give £1 a month or 50p a month or something like that, like there's no one who can't do 50p a month. There's no one who can't do £1 a month. And the idea is that by telling everyone to do one page of Talmud a day, that would be anyone would be able to do one page of Talmud a day. So that would be a nice thing to do in the yeshiva, so that people had basic knowledge of the Talmud. Maybe it's worth saying that the Talmud is a very, very big book. And there's around 2,800 pages in the Talmud. And most rabbis have never studied the Talmud from the beginning to the end. And I would add myself to the pile of all the other rabbis who've never studied the Talmud to the beginning at the end. And to complete the entire Talmud is a tremendous thing. And there's an assumption in Daf Yomi that you're not really going to do it in any kind of depth, but that will give you some kind of breadth. And that's what they did in the yeshiva in Lublin. Then it starts to become a world project. It becomes a world project really in 1920 at the World Conference of the Agudat Yisrael. Just a word about Agudat Yisrael. I think we see here at the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the Jewish world is changing. One of those changes is the founding of the World Zionist Organization, which also kind of had its first international congress just at the very end of the 19th century. And we don't think about it, but before that, the idea of having a Congress of all the Jews in the world, or representing all the Jews in the world, would just be beyond conception. And the World Zionist Organization that brought together Jews from America and Jews from Europe and Jews from Israel and Jews from other places, and they all came together into one political grouping, was kind of a tremendous change in the Jewish world. And the ultra-Orthodox, or as they called themselves then, the Orthodox, weren't part of that because they were all anti-Zionists, but there was a recognition that there was a political force happening out there, and that the Orthodox forces didn't have a voice in the politics of the Jewish world, the newly emerging international Jewish world. And Agudat Yisrael was founded as a political representation for what they called the world orthodoxy. And in the first conference, which took place in Vienna in December 1920, Meir Shapiro stood up And he put forward the proposal that the study of a page of Talmud a day would be something that would be able to unify the Jews everywhere. It was a political statement, and it was a social statement, and it was a sign of tremendous strength. And here's a quote from the speech that he gave in the Congress. He said, "What a great thing. A Jew travels by boat and takes Gemara Brachot under his arm. He travels for 15 days from Eretz Yisrael to America, and each day he learns the daf. And when he arrives in America, he enters a base midrash in New York, and he finds Jews learning the very same daf that he studied on that day, and he gladly joins them. Another Jew leaves the States and travels to Brazil or Japan, and he first goes to the base midrash where he'll find everyone studying the same daf that he himself has learned that day. Could there be a greater unity of hearts than this?" So kind of it's a political statement, and I just see if you're interested in history, it's kind of, you see the world changing. The idea that someone would just leave the United States and go to Israel or go to Japan, the kind of it's the beginning of the world of international travel. It's the beginning of the Jewish international world coming together. It's the beginning of the emergence of political forces of Zionism and anti-Zionism, of orthodoxy and reform and non-orthodoxy and secularism. It's kind of the Jewish world in upheaval. And one of the things that the Agudat Yisrael does to unify its forces and to bring them together is to launch this project of everyone studying a page of Talmud a day. That's the proposal. And later, Meir Shapiro said that he didn't actually think that anyone would do it. And he really thought it would be something that you would get some young students in Poland would do it, because Poland is the kind of place where people still study Torah. But he didn't really expect it to spread around the world. New York wasn't the kind of place that people studied the way that they studied in Poland. In any case, the project spread around the world. It started, I can go back, the first cycle started on the 11th of September, 1923. So between the proposal in 1920 until they got around to organizing it and doing it, the 11th of September, 1923, just to point out, it's the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So they did the first day of Brachot on the first day of Rosh Hashanah of that year. Symbolically, the Ger Rebbe taught that first page in his shul as the official launch of the project, and it has been going ever since. And it captivated the imagination of Jews all around the world. And that was the next slide already, just to point out. Nowadays, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people take part in the Daf Yomi project of doing one page a year. We're now in the 14th cycle. So since 1923 to today, we're in the 14th time. It takes about 7.5 years to run through the entire Talmud. And right, only the first cycle started on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Since then, the second cycle started when the first cycle ended. And I was just discussing with my son today when it will come back to start on Rosh Hashanah again, probably in 50,000 years or something like that. In any case, it spread around the world. And just to give you an idea of the way it spread, here's a street in Bnei Brak that's named after the Daf Yomi. So we have Ma'alot Daf Yomi. Right, you see Misodo Shel Hagon Hanoda Rabbi Meir Zatzal Lublin, established by the famous Rabbi Meir of Lublin. That's in Bnei Brak. There are regular podcasts, Daf Yomi for Kids, and Daf Yomi for Kids. It actually, you can get it at different levels depending on the age of your child, but your children aren't going to be left out. Here's an example of a kind of a booklet that you can buy inside the Daf, and it has for each of the pages of the Talmud activities for children to be done on that page of the Talmud, so that already very young children can get into the cycle of the Daf Yomi. The next one is actually my favorite one. I couldn't believe it when I saw this one, but it cocomes out in Israel and it's called Daf Yomi LeYiladim. But the difference between this and the previous one is that I'm sure we're all familiar, anyone who's a parent or has been a child is familiar with the kind of storybooks that have 365 bedtime stories for each day of the year. And this is a Daf Yomi bedtime storybook. And for each of the pages of the Talmud, there's a bedtime story to tell your children. Of course, these are the kind of books that are for very young children. It's your 3-year-olds and your 4-year-olds. There are pages of the Talmud I have no idea how they can make a children's story out of, but someone has come out and done Daf Yomi as a children's story every night. And just the last slide on the historical thing, this is a picture of the Siyum HaShas. The Siyum HaShas literally means the end of the Talmud, and it's a celebration that takes place every 7.5 years when the cycle of the Daf Yomi comes to the end of the cycle. The people who have been studying come together to study the last page together. This is in New York. I think it's actually in New Jersey, but it's for the New York area. And there's tens and tens of thousands of people here. And anyone who's been at a Siyum HaShas knows that what's most surprising about the Siyum HaShas, what isn't really typical about this picture, is that you expect it all to be people with black hats and beards, which in this picture, they're predominantly black hats and beards, but that's not actually the story of the Siyum HaShas. One of the interesting things about the Siyum HaShas is the range of people who have gotten into the Daf Yomi project. And there are people study Daf Yomi because they want to study it from a secular point of view, or they want to study it from a Zionist point of view, or they want to study it from a text critical point of view, and they're modern Orthodox and they're anti-modern Orthodox, and all of those things together. The Talmud, of course, is very pliable, and it's open to all kinds of different ways of interpreting it. And all of that, the Daf Yomi project has captured the imagination of Jews from all across the religious spectrum. So to see just a stadium like this of Jews who have come together because they want to study a page of Talmud, it's really quite mind-boggling. So that's kind of my little bit of introduction about the Daf Yomi project. I have to say it's not the only way to study Talmud. And I actually come from a different tradition. I have to say that I'm not from the world where you study a page of Talmud a day. I come from the world, and there were certainly yeshivot who were was built on that kind of thing. As you go into the yeshiva and you start studying page 1, and the second day you're on page 1, and the third day and you're on page 1, and 6 months later you're still on page 1 because there's so much in that page. What does it mean to do a page of Talmud in a day? So I actually come from the tradition where it's kind of, you never actually get beyond the first page of the Talmud, because the hafochba, the kuliba, go over it, everything is in it, is as kind of a parable from the Talmud itself. Anyway, that's kind of a little bit of a background. I have to say that Meir Shapiro, when he launched it, was kind of tying himself to a very ancient and a very well-known Jewish tradition of daily study. And I'll just point out kind of some of the roots of the Daf Yomi before we get into our Daf. The first thing is in the Book of Joshua, chapter 1. Book of Joshua, chapter 1, Joshua, of course, leads the Jewish people after the death of Moses, and he gets appointed as the leader. And in his God's introduction to him, his appointment of him as the new leader of the Jewish people, we read, Rak chazak ve'amatz me'od. You must be very strong and resolute to observe faithfully all the teaching that my servant Moses enjoined upon you. Do not deviate it from the right to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. Let not this book of teaching cease from your lips, but recite it day and night, so that you may observe faithfully all that is written in it. And that in the Hebrew, V'higita bo yomam v'layla, you shall observe it and you shall ponder it, literally. Higita bo, you shall ponder this book day and night. And that has always been understood quite literally, that you should study Talmud minimum twice a day, day and night. And although it's kind of in its original context, it just means all the time. You should study Torah all the time. Maybe just as an aside, I have to say that in the Eastern European yeshivot, they took this literally, and in the yeshivot of the Mitnagdim, the Ponevezh yeshiva, but also the Lublin yeshiva that comes from the same school, the Telz yeshiva, they had this idea that it's the study of Torah that keeps the world going. In other words, if there was ever a second, if there was a split second that there wasn't someone in the world studying Torah, the world would just disappear. Now, they believe that very strongly because it says, V'higita bo yomam v'layla, you have to ponder it day and night. So throughout the day and throughout the night, you had to study Torah. And in the big yeshivot, like the Ponevezh yeshiva, there would be a rota of people who would be around the clock, 24 hours studying in the Beit Midrash, so the Beit Midrash would never be empty. They had that. But the other way of interpreting this is you have to study the Torah minimally, at least once a day and once a night. That at least twice a day you have times that you study Torah. You have the following statement in the Talmud: Afilu lo shana daber perek echad shacharit v'perek echad aravit. Right, we learn that if a man studies but one chapter in the morning and one chapter in the evening, he has fulfilled the precept of this book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. Lo yamush sefer Torah mipicha. That was in the verse that we read. And so if you study one chapter of Torah in the morning and the evening, you will have fulfilled that. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, even though a man but reads the Shema in the morning and the Shema in the evening, he has fulfilled this precept, right? Symbolically, we recite the Shema twice a day, and symbolically, that's studying the Torah twice a day. Right, if you ever want to know why you have to study the Shema, why you have to recite the Shema twice a day, is that one has to have studied some Torah, and the minimal way of doing that is a paragraph from the Torah, and the paragraph is the paragraph of the Shema. And there's a famous, I guess, amongst the rabbis, it's famous, the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi used to study in the Beit Midrash from morning till night. He was teaching. He was the editor of the Mishnah. And at one point, one of the students looks up and he says, I've been sitting here with Rebbe. We've been studying the whole day, and I haven't noticed that he recites the Shema. Right here you have one of the great teachers of Israel, but didn't do a basic religious precept of reciting the Shema. And the answer is that he didn't need to recite the Shema because he was teaching Torah. The Shema itself, you only do it in order to symbolically be studying Torah, the minimal amount. So here Rebbe, because he was teaching Torah the whole time, didn't actually need to recite the Shema. But on the back of this sense that you study Torah all the time, that every day you have to have a period of studying Torah, we kind of build this idea of the Daf Yomi. So now we jump to today's Daf Yomi. So, right, I had absolutely no say into what page we were going to do. No one came to me and said, what's your favorite page of Talmud? Choose that and you can teach it. I was given that today is the 28th of February, and whatever is the 28th of February, 2021, that's the page that I had to teach. So the page that we have today is Pessachim, chapter... page 99. And here we go. Where Pessachim page 99 is the page that we have today. And it almost couldn't have been planned better, because Tractate Pesachim is a tractate of the Talmud that deals with the laws of Pesach. It's made up of 10 chapters. There are 9 chapters that are the most boring part of the Talmud, of the Talmud. And page 99 is the beginning of chapter 10. So just to give you an idea, the first, I don't remember, it was 4 or 5 chapters in Pesachim deal with searching for chametz and clearing out the house and how you get things kosher for Pesach. The next 4 or 5 chapters deal with sacrifices in the temple on Pesach, and chapter 10 deals with the Seder. So here we go. They're the beginning of the section of the Mishnah and then the section of the Talmud that deals with what is the structure of the Seder and what do you have to do on that night. And that, of course, it's one of the more interesting parts of the discussion, amongst other things, is that the Seder itself is a completely rabbinic invention. It's kind of one of the big developments that happened in the history of the Jewish people was that with the destruction of the temple, we stopped doing Torah Judaism and we moved into Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism was kind of a reinvention of Judaism to kind of cope with the fact that the temple didn't exist anymore. And that manifests itself in all kinds of different places in the Jewish world. And one of them was inventing new rituals. And one of the new rituals that got invented was the Seder. So here we jump into the page that deals with this invention. It's also, I believe the statistics show the second most widely observed ritual of the Jewish tradition is the night of the Seder. It's kind of, you ask people, what do you do? So if you ask kind of how many people observe Shatnez, or how many people even build a sukkah, or how many people whatever, I think the second most popular ritual is the is the Seder. I know everyone's asking what the most popular ritual is. So just as an aside, I would say the most widely observed ritual of the families, right? Obviously not individuals, is circumcising their male children. That's the most widely observed Jewish tradition. And the second one is having a Seder in one form whatsoever. Okay. So we have page 99, and I'll just point out, if you want to know how to find it and how to get to it, then one of the best resources for studying Talmud that we have today is something called Sefaria. And Sefaria is an online collection of loads and loads of Jewish texts, but amongst the Jewish texts that it has on it is the entire Talmud, and it's the entire Talmud with a very decent English translation. So there's no excuse whatsoever if you you can't say that you don't have the Talmud. You can just log on, you can just have it. I have to say, when I was in university and studying in the Talmud department, the Talmud's a very big book. It's 2,800 pages. And one of the problems is when you were studying is that every page of Talmud, you have to have every other page of Talmud at your disposal, because there's always going back and forth between the different pages. And how do you schlep the Talmud with you when you go to classes was always a difficult thing. So everyone had a small 20-volume set of Talmud in their rucksack that they had to take with them to classes. So just having Sefaria on a tablet where you can just open up and you have the entire Talmud there, it's unimaginable. And I just want to point out, here's on the front page of Sefaria, it has what parsha it is this week and what's the haftarah this week, and then it tells you what's the Daf Yomi today. So you'll always find it the third or fourth thing down, the Daf Yomi of that particular day. So I just clipped this clip from the front page of Sefaria. So it tells us it's Psachim 99, page 99 of Tractate Psachim, and the Mishnah's Erev Psachim Samuch LeMincha, on the eve of Passover, adjacent to Mincha time. A person may not eat until dark, so that he will be able to eat matzah that night with a hearty appetite. And even the poorest of Jews should not eat the meal on Passover night until he reclines on his left side, etc., etc. It just gives you a clip on it. But also, I'll point out that they have in Sefaria, which is also interesting, is that they have sheets. I don't know if some of you have worked with Sefaria, some of you haven't worked with Sefaria, but it's possible in Sefaria to collect sources together and create a worksheet. And when you create a worksheet or a study sheet, you can share it with anyone else who comes onto Sefaria. And Sefaria automatically gathers together study sheets on that page, which is the Daf Yomi of that particular day. So just to give you an idea of what we have for today. So on today's Daf, someone, Rabbi David Polsky, has put together a sheet of 4 cups, their purpose and their number, because we read here in the Mishnah already, Lo yifchatu lo be'arba kotzot shel yayin, is that even the poorest of Jews, excuse me, it's clipped it before the third line. Lo yifchatu lo be'arba kotzot shel yayin is a person should not have less than 4 cups of wine. So on that, here we have a study sheet on the 4 cups of wine. Someone else has done a study sheet on the concept of Tosefet Shabbat. Tosefet Shabbat literally is the addition that one makes to the time of Shabbat. You might not be aware of it, but Shabbat legally runs from sunset one day until sunset the following day, but we never celebrate Shabbat for 24 hours. We always add some extra to Shabbat at the beginning of Shabbat. Depends on the local custom. In England, they tend to add 18 minutes at the beginning of Shabbat. Some places they do 15 minutes, some places 16 minutes. In Jerusalem, if you've ever been in Jerusalem, you might notice that Shabbat comes in much earlier in Jerusalem than Tel Aviv. It's because they add 28 minutes at the beginning of Shabbat, because it's Jerusalem. Why not make life more difficult for people? And that extra time is called Tosefet Shabbat. And at the end of Shabbat, some people add 45 minutes after sunset at the end of Shabbat, and some people wait until they see 3 stars, and some people wait half an hour after you see 3 stars. There's different customs, and that extra bit is called Tosefet Shabbat. And it so happens that on our page of Talmud, when they're looking at the border between Shabbat and Pesach, they also discuss these extra times at the beginning. So he's done a sheet on the subject of Tosefet Shabbat. And the third subject that it suggests the worksheet, the level, scope, and nature, which is a third concept, which is really quite interesting. And that is, you may be aware that there's a difference between men and women's obligations to certain mitzvot, and that women are exempt in principle from positive time-bound commandments. Positive time-bound commandments is any commandment which is, first of all, a positive commandment. You have to do it rather than then you're not allowed to do it. So blow the shofar is a positive commandment. Don't work on Shabbat is a negative commandment. And time-bound means that it only applies at a certain period of time. Like blowing the shofar only applies on the day of Rosh Hashanah. So blowing the shofar is a positive time-bound commandment, and that's the general principle, but there's also exceptions to the rule. And one of the exceptions of the rule is the obligation of drinking wine on the night of the Seder, or having the night of the Seder, or eating matzah on Pesach, the commandments of Pesach, even though by definition those are positive commandments. You have to eat matzah on the night of Pesach. That's a positive commandment. And it's certainly time-bound because the commandment applies on Pesach. It doesn't apply during the year, but women are equally obligated to men. And they're obligated we're on the weekend of Purim, so I can say another exception to the rule of positive time-bound commandments is hearing the Megillah and reading the Megillah, and you'll find in Orthodox circles the women Megillah reading and things like that. It's because Megillah is also an exception to that rule, as is lighting Hanukkah candles, and all of these things share in common. The principle is af hen hayu ba'oto hanes. They were also part of the miracle. In other words, when God redeemed the children of Israel from Egypt, he also redeemed the women. And when the Jews were saved at Purim, the women were also saved. And not only were the women also saved, but the Jews were actually saved by a woman, and that was Esther. And at Pesach, the whole cycle of redemption of Pesach starts with Miriam standing by the water, overseeing her brother, making sure that he didn't drown in the Nile, and that he was cared for. And there's a halachic concept of af hen hayu ba'oto hanes, and someone's created a study sheet. I'm just saying that because one of the ways you study the Daf Yomi is not just reading the entire page, but choosing one or more interesting subjects on that page and looking at it a little bit broader. So just reading a page of Talmud isn't interesting. Reading a page of Talmud and choosing, I'd really like to hear about that concept of af hen hayu ba'oto hanes. I'd really like to understand why we drink 4 cups of wine. That's the way you make it interesting. Indeed, that's really the way that you make Talmud interesting. Okay, so I've just opened it up here, and let's see if that works. I'm going to jump over to Sapphire. This will either share for us or it won't. Okay, so what I'm going to do, because it's not jumping over, is I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to share another page, which will be the browser with the Safari window. Here, now you get to see me in big, and we get to share again, but this time we're sharing this screen, and okay, so here we are on page 99, and this is the Mishnah. And let's start to read it together and see what we can make of this Mishnah. Look at that. I've been talking so much that I actually haven't got it to the Daf Yomi, but let's get into it. So the Mishnah reads, on the eve of Passover adjacent to Mincha time, a person may not eat until it gets dark, so that he will be able to eat matzah that night with a hearty appetite. Even the poorest of Jews should not eat the meal on Passover night until he reclines on his left side. And the distributors of charity should not give a poor person less than 4 cups of wine for the festival meal. And this halakha applies even if the poor person is one of the poorest members of society and receives his food from the charity plate. That's the Mishnah. And it basically starts the Mishnah of the 10th chapter, which I said the subject of that Mishnah is the night of the Seder. And it goes through the Seder from the beginning to the end. The Mishnah is organized in chronological order, and it goes from the beginning to the end and talks about each part of the Seder. And here, I guess it's just talking about setting the table at the beginning. And it starts before you've even gotten to the Seder with the fact that you don't eat on the afternoon before Pesach in order to arrive at the Seder hungry. You should always arrive at the Seder with a good appetite. And then going on to the setting of the table, which is also going to take place on the afternoon before, and to tell us that you have to have 4 cups of wine at the table. If I would just point out some things in the Mishnah before we go on, is that the Mishnah addresses different people in each line of the Mishnah. We have like we have just 3 lines of text, and even in the 3 lines of text, it moves from who it's actually talking to. So in the first line, it says, Erev Pesach Samuch Mincha, Lo Yochal Adam Ad Shetechshach. A person may not eat until it gets dark. So the first line, it's just talking about a person. It's kind of telling us about everyone. Right? That's the thing. No one's allowed to eat. The next line, Afilu ani shebIsrael lo yochal ad sheyesev. Even the poor of Israel should not eat until the yesev. Literally, it means to lean to the left. But in the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud, to lean at the word to lean at the table is meant to partake in a formal meal, right? If you're right, if you're just having a snack, you might have a snack while you're walking along the way. You might be eating a falafel on the road or something like that. You might even just sit and eat something quickly by yourself. But if you have a formal meal in the Roman world, you eat on your side. And that's a sign that kind of this is a real formal meal. And on the night of the Seder, you have to have a formal meal. So even the poor of Israel isn't allowed to eat until they sit down for the formal meal of the Seder. But again, just pointing out, the first line talks about everyone. The second line talks about the poor people. And then we come to the third line, they do not give him less than 4 cups of wine. Even if he's eating from the charity plate. That's an institution that they had at the time of the Mishnah, that it's basically equivalent to our soup kitchens. And they would gather, they had tzedakah that they would gather money, but they also had the tamchui where they would gather from people portions of food and share them with the poor. And what's important for us here is that the tamchui is the poorest of the poor. Right. If you were a little bit above, right, if you could still be poor and not qualify for the charity plate. You could be poor enough that you qualified for tzedakah, and you would receive some funds in order to help you manage. And you could be poor enough that you'd be entitled to housing and things like that. But to be at the level that you were entitled to eat out of the tamchui meant that you were really the poorest of the poor of the poor. And so the Mishnah starts by giving a mitzvah that's for everyone, and then it goes down and talks about the poor, and then it talks about the poorest of the poor in society. So it wants to give us this sense that it kind of is talking about everyone, and that the night of the Seder is an obligation for absolutely everyone. There's no one who is exempt from the rituals of the night of the Seder, and that these are things that is a responsibility for society. Right? There could be people who are too poor to have wine at the table. Actually, wine is a luxury item, but there can't be a society that's too poor to provide wine for every single member of society, and the commitment to the community to make sure that everyone has enough on their table in order to celebrate the Pessah properly. The Talmud goes on, and maybe I'll just read the first line of the Talmud and then come to a bit of a summary. The Talmud goes on to discuss this, and the Talmud, I'll just read in the English here, the Talmud expresses surprise at the Mishnah statement that one may not eat on the Passover Eve from the time adjacent to Mincha. Why discuss this halacha, particularly with regard to the eves of Passover? Because even on the eve of Shabbat and on festivals, it's also prohibited to eat in the late afternoon, as we were taught. A person should not eat on the eves of Shabbat and festivals from Mincha time onward, so that he shall enter the Sabbath when he has a desire to eat, and he will enjoy the Sabbath meal. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, you're not allowed to eat any Friday afternoon. So if you're not allowed to eat any Friday afternoon, so what's so special about the eve of Pesach that there's a prohibition on the eve of Pesach? Now, I'm coming already to the end of my time, and we're not going to get to an answer to that. And the truth is, we're not going to get to an answer on that because that's on tomorrow's page.